Thank you for joining the Known Experience. Today, Sean and I are joined by Dr. Steve Garber. Sean and I have both been exposed to Steve's work through some different avenues, but Stephen Garber was a professor of marketplace theology and leadership at Regent College in Vancouver, and he completed his PhD in philosophy of learning at Penn State, where he focused on the connection between belief and behavior. His books include Fabric of Faithfulness, which came out of that thesis, Visions of Vocation, and The Seamless Life. And he now lives in the DC area with his wife, Meg. He has 5 children. And Steve, how many grandchildren are we on now?
1,800. We have 12 grandchildren. Yeah.
As of this moment.
As of this moment into the foreseeable future.
Yeah. But I think your work and your book that speaks the most to this podcast and our focus is probably The Seamless Life, where you challenge people to move behind a fragmented sense of reality, beginning to work and see all that we do, our work, our play, our relationships, our faith, our loved ones, as one singular integrated experience. And that was also somewhat the focus of your thesis for your doctorate. Why has that been a concept that has really intrigued you, or that you seems to be enamored with this concept of bringing life all together into one seamless experience?
That's a very good question, John. And we could talk for a long time and go for a long walk about that for probably several days in a row. But, I could respond truthfully by saying my father and grandfather were good teachers to me. My grandfather's life, he bought and sold cattle in Colorado. And though he did probably never ever, he was a college educated, read 2 newspapers every day of his life and kept up with the news a lot, really, and politics a lot and the world a lot. But I doubt he'd ever read St. Benedict. But when I began to read St. Benedict many years later, after my grandfather had come and gone, I began to think, my grandfather had a life of ora et labora, didn't he? Where praying and working were held together in one life. And so as a little boy, I spent most of my summers with my grandparents in Colorado and was enamored of, the cattle world and all that involved, and learned how to use a rope and all those things. But I remember that night by night we would meet after supper, after gun smoke. We would get on our knees, and my grandfather would lead the family in praying, and he would pray. Every time I remember these words: "To every knee shall bow, every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord of Lords and King of Kings." And I took part in it with obedience and with hope, and as a little boy even and. But then I would go off with my grandfather to buy cattle too, which was a gift to me in my boyhood years. And it was intriguing to me to see how much his world of other cattle buyers in Colorado, how much they respected him and honored him and took his counsel. Even one time we were down the very southwestern corner of Colorado, a place called Cortez, where the 4 corners meet each other between Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado. And the auctioneer, if you've ever been to a cattle auction, stopped his auctioneering and asked my grandfather, Mr. Gilchrist, what are these cattle selling for this week? And I was 10. I didn't know very much about anything really, but I remember remembering that, and thinking even then, but more years later, the auctioneer knew that my grandfather would know the price. He was really good at what he did. Of all the buyers that were there, my grandfather would know the price. And he would trust my grandfather to tell him the truth about the price. He wouldn't. He was a math genius, my grandfather. He could have quickly changed the numbers for his own benefit, but he knew he would be, a truth teller, and that he knew his work very, very well. But I knew that for my grandfather too, that there was not like a line between his praying and his working. When I began to think about, life and faith and worldview and belief and behavior and all these things began to be dominant in my thinking about life. I began to look back on my boyhood years and thinking, my granddad actually taught me to see this way, to live this way, to think this way. I could tell more stories, but that would be one that for me, I think, was pretty shaping of who I am, how I see life, and how I want to live my own life.
Yeah. So when this journey began, um, in process, right? Things, discovery happens, experience happens, education happens. So who were you and who are you? Along this
Uh-huh.
process, how has it shaped you?
Hmm. Again, Sean, we could talk for hours about the question, but this is true also. More could be said. I was raised by grandmothers and grandfathers and mothers and father who loved me and who loved God and wanted me to live in God's world as best I was figure out how to do that. Um, but I would say that, like all boys becoming men in this world, I was trying to figure out who I was going to be and what I was going to believe and how I was going to think and who I would be when I grew up to be, more than just a boy in this world. Um, I remember hearing the word worldview when I was about 17 for the first time. And did I have a worldview? Everyone has a worldview. Everyone has a
Sure.
way of seeing life and the world. And I did too, at 5, at 10, at 15, and at 17. I just had never heard a word like worldview before. And I remember thinking that it intrigued me, particularly because what I could understand was it offered a more coherent, comprehensive view of everything about me, all the things that I cared about. Uh, but I remember thinking, because I was 17 and then becoming 18 pretty quickly after that, that if I was going to be serious about the idea of a worldview, I have to rethink girls, wouldn't I? So before I got to politics, which brought me to Washington some years later to teach politics for most of my life, or got to the arts, which has taken me all over the country and the world. Before I got to economics, I served as a senior advisor to the Mars Corporation's Economics and Mutuality Project. Before I got to these bigger questions in some ways for life in the society, I'd have to rethink what cared most about at 17, which were girls. Because if it wasn't true for the girls of my life, how could it be true for politics? How could it be true for a globalizing world? Now,
Mm,
those are questions I've taken up in my life in the years since then. But at 17, 18, I remember feeling quite keenly, a little bit painfully, what would this mean for girls then, Steve Garber? And I began to, for the first time ever, John, to ask deeper questions about how I thought and how I would, what I understood relationships to me in God's world. And I would, it's a longer discussion to go into from all that, but I would say that, I began to realize in some ways those deepest questions for all of us as human beings. But for me, clearly as a emerging young man in the world, um, it had to be worked out there if it was going to be worked out in the rest of my life into the public square eventually. More could be said.
yeah.
I feel like we live in a world where people's values and views in politics are more fragmented and less seamless than ever. But before we go too far down that, this idea of seeing life seamlessly, what does that mean? Like, where does it start for us? I mean, I know you said it started, with the most basic thing in your life at 17 is girls. But as an adult who maybe is like really being confronted with this in a new way, how would you like communicate or explain or suggest we begin to see life seamlessly?
If I can draw back to an earlier conversation you and I had, John, you asked if I knew the Laity Lodge, and I said that I did. I've been there many times. And for those who don't know, it's a remarkable retreat center in the hill country of Texas, about an hour and a half west of San Antonio, and brought into being by uh, the unfortunately named Butt family of Texas. Um, but they've been very good people and have done very good work in Texas for 125 years now, essentially. Um, but when HEB, which is the name of their grocery store company throughout Texas and northern Mexico, when HEB was beginning to sell a lot of bread and a lot of milk to Texans, um, Howard E. Butt Jr., had gone off to Baylor University and became friends with Billy Graham. They were about the same ages, actually. And they both had this sense of longing and desire and maybe gift from God to be evangelists. We had to speak it in crusades together. But here's Howard Butt, who's the son of Howard E. Butt Sr., who was the runner who ran a business. And his long expectation was his oldest son would pick up the business too in his life. For the next 10 years, Howard E. Butt Jr. had what we would describe as his own wrangling of soul over what the work of his life was supposed to be about. And to put it kind of candidly and poetically, maybe a little bit, who was calling him? His Father in heaven, his Father on earth. Because in his own ecclesial world in Texas, clearly a call to ministry was a higher calling than business. The Lady Lodge was born out of that wrestling that he did in his 20s, actually, as a place to come think through, what does calling mean in this life? And can you actually be somebody called to a life in the world? For years and years, he did not before a podcast, but a radio show he called The Higher Calling. And it was really looking at the world of work. So I would say when we have theological, sociological, philosophical, ways to divide up life for ourselves, you say, well, yes, but, but I've been called to, my father does business, but you see, business is just business. I'm being called to ministry instead, which is a higher calling. And Howard Butt gave his life to trying to reverse that thinking in the church in America, actually. I live in Washington, D.C., and everybody in Washington who works on Capitol Hill is, by reputation, a Baptist, a Methodist, a Catholic, Episcopalian, a Presbyterian. There are a few nuns, N-O-N-E-S, but most people identify in some way with the ecclesial tradition. But almost nobody seems, as I would watch the world right now in Washington, is shaped by those deeper set of loyalties to the gospel of the kingdom. It's much more, I'm a conservative first, I'm a liberal first, I'm a Republican first, Democrat first. Oh, yes, I'm a Catholic too. Yes, I'm an Episcopalian. Yes, I'm a Baptist too. But you want to know what I really think? It's what the party says I think. That's how I think, really. And for my life here in the city, which has been 35 years now, John, I have argued all day long, wherever I can be, that the gospel of the kingdom cuts deeper than the partisan divide. And so in some questions, you might sound more like them and some more like them, really. But that doesn't in some ways finally matter because your deeper allegiance, your deeper commitments are to something that matters more, that cuts deeper than the partisan divide. So for me, it's wanting my deepest beliefs, my deepest loves, my deepest commitments to actually shape how I think, shape how I live in politics, and the rest of life too.
Yeah, I would say in my life, that's been an evolution of the last 5 to 10 years, more rapidly of pulling away from the polarizing perspectives. And I just personally, I've found that it can be a place of loneliness because it's not as easy to identify your tribe, or it's kind of like every tribe dislikes me in some way because I don't fully line up with them. So is that an experience that you've found, or an experience that people run into when they begin to really pursue a more integrated life like this?
Yeah, I would say that's very much the way it is. And I'm not looking to be a martyr about anything, really. Or not looking to be to quote one of your own heroes there in Texas, a Lone Ranger either. But I would say that my deeper friendships, people who think this way with me, who we share this commitment together about God, the world, about politics, about the public life of the world, vocation in the world. In one of the essays in the Seamless Life book, I wrote about the nothing but temptation. And it's arguing that, when you say, oh, sex is nothing but, girls are nothing but, marriage is nothing but, or business is nothing but, or politics is nothing but, really. What you're giving into is a temptation which ought not to be when we get close to it all, really. Because you see, in some ways, it takes away from this more comprehensive, coherent account of the wholeness of life, which is what drew me to the idea of a worldview initially. If we say, well, I work a lot in business with people in the business world these days, and clearly the mindset of most people in the business world is business is just business, without thinking through, are there ways of doing business, of thinking about the business of business? But how would you enter into the public life, to the life of the world, in language which you and I've talked a little bit about, John? Learning to sing songs shaped by the truest truths of the universe in language the whole world can understand. That isn't just true for national musicians, it's true for business people too, people in the political world too. But can you take things which matter most to you, the deepest things you believe in, and actually have them shape how you think, shape how you see, shape how you see the world, shape how you live in the world, really? I could tell you story after story that I'm not a partisan person in the city, and people know that, though that's a hard thing people understand. Like, well, you have to be. When they say you're this, you must be that, of course, Steve. There was a long friend of ours who's a former Republican from Texas, of all places, and a dear friend, and came to the city many years ago, and married for a long time, and his wife began to become sicker and sicker, and was in the George Washington University Hospital for about a month one time. And Meg and I went to visit her several times. And one night we were there, and he said, "Oh, Steve, you wouldn't believe we came to see Rosemary last night." And he mentioned the woman's name. I said, "Yes, I know her." And he said, "Oh, well, she knows you too." Because she asked, "Well, who comes to see Rosemary?" I said, "Oh, Meg and Steve Garber do." And she said, "Oh, Steve Garber, such a liberal, isn't he?" He's a very well-known Republican conservative politico in the city of Washington. And Bo said, "He's not either." And she said, "Oh, he is too. He's an environmentalist." Now, I've never in my life ever used that term about myself. Do I care about the creation? Yes, I do. I care about the earth and the heaven and the seas and the skies. I do, really. I care about reptiles and cows and horses and butterflies. Yes, I do. Do I love to grow my flowers? I do, really. But I'm not identified in a partisan way with environmentalism in that kind of more partisan way. But to simply be somebody who would be known in the city as caring about the way the world works and how we take care of it, I could be pigeonholed as, "Oh, such a liberal, isn't he, really?" As if somehow, if you cared about things like that, you clearly weren't part of our tribe, our camp. Because, of course, why? We don't care about things like that from our side. That's those guys over there. And I have little time for that, though I've lived in that world for most of my life now. So.
Yeah. It's often said, or people say, I'm not what I do. Right. So, but we are what we choose. Right. So,
yeah. That's true. That's profound. Right.
Yeah. And so therefore what we do is a part of who we are, for better or for worse. Right. So it's just like the guy that says, your business is your business. And another person told me, let your investments be your investments. And it never made sense to me. Right. It's always been a very frustrating thing for me to grapple with. And even more so now with children. Right. What I end up doing, unless you are in a very, constrained life for, by external circumstances that you can't control much of anything. But I always want my kids to see consistency, right? So if I say, this is important to me, then what I do is actually a reflection of who I am. And so do you find that, that challenging for most people to really understand, right? I don't know if it's a lack of understanding, and our choices are who we are, therefore what we do is a part of who we are, or is it more of that entanglement can be too much, right? Life is already challenging enough, so I don't need to have to somehow have this existential crisis about what I do too, right? Like, let my work be my work. Life is hard enough. Do you understand what I'm saying? That was kind of a long-winded question, but it's always, for me, it was girls, and I don't want to live like most 40-year-old men, I'm now 44, who seem very disconnected with what they do. Or it's for the simple outcome of money. That didn't make sense when I was 17 and chasing and understanding girls, or now 44, I still don't understand a life like that. So what do you find it to be a challenge, and what's the reason of the disconnect?
Yeah, it is a wonderful question, though. That's the kind of question we should talk about for a long time. On the one hand, I am pretty deeply committed to this insight of the Oxford moral philosopher Iris Murdoch, who wrote some years ago, at crucial moments of choice, most of the business of choosing is already over.
Ooh, I like that.
I do too. Because, of course, we choose out of who we are, out of the choices we've made. Is this fatalism? I don't think it's fatalism at all. Is it karma? I don't think it's karma at all, actually. But I think that, in Václav Havel's, best imagery or best teaching, the secret of man is the secret of his responsibility. So here's the Czech political philosopher, poet, playwright, become president, understanding his own culture and century in Central Europe and realizing that apart from the Czech people recovering the idea of responsibility for themselves, for the future, there was no future for them. It'd always been totalitarianism up to that point, really. The Nazis, the communists deciding what the day was going to be like and whether the sun was going to shine or not, and what books you were going to read and where you could work and where you could go to school. And so when communism imploded finally and Havel became the leader for 10 years, he kept saying all over the world, the secret of man is the secret of his responsibility. So I've taken that to heart quite deeply, actually. And I think at the heart of who we are as human beings is our ability to respond, our responsibility. So to pair that up with Iris Murdoch's, at crucial moments of choice, most of the business of choosing is already over. In my mind, is really, it helps us think about this question. I would say, to add a little bit more to this, because it's a good question, that I think we are, as sons of Adam, daughters of Eve, disposed to dualism. And it's a heartache, it's a tragedy, actually, because it has far-reaching consequences for everything about us as human beings. Several years ago, I was speaking in Birmingham at the tragically iconic 16th Street Baptist Church, where the little girls were murdered one Sunday morning in the early 1960s. And I was asked to speak on the question for the whole city, for a prayer breakfast for the city, what would the recovery of the idea of vocation mean for the renewal of our city? And I took it quite seriously, and a lot more could be said about it. But I told the story that morning because when I walked in, I saw this glass case by the front door. I knew the story immediately. It was a glass case, and covering a slave ship from the Middle Passage, bringing Africans to the New World to be enslaved in Georgia and South Carolina and on and a terrible, terrible part of our history, really. But it was there at the beginning of walking into the room. Ironically, but providentially too, I suppose, we sang Amazing Grace when we finished this prayer breakfast for the city of Birmingham. I sang, but also with kind of an ache in my heart, thinking, but John Newton, this is your story, really. It'd be a happier story if we could say, well, John Newton found a Bible on board ship, repented, wrote Amazing Grace, talked to William Wilberforce, and praise be to God. What a good story that is, really. The harder, truer story is that he actually kept trading slaves for years afterwards, after his repentant faith. And he would literally have studies of the Bible on the top deck with officers, while the slaves were manacled below in the holds, for weeks and weeks on end, really. Seeing no relationship between his new faith and his life, his work, actually. And it's even harder because it's the first record we have is about 34 years later. He wrote a letter, which, you can find, where he says out loud for the first time, that we have record of at least, I know that I was once part of a terrible, terrible thing in life. I did this with my life. So every indication that he himself realizes that it was amazing grace who found a wretch like me is true. But in terms of holding together a more coherent sense of, I think this way, I believe this to be true, I live and work this way, it wasn't true for much of his life, actually. And I believe that we shouldn't be disdainful of him because we're all disposed to dualism. But I do think in some ways, quite profoundly, at crucial moments of choice, most of the business of choosing is already over.
Yeah.
Wow, that quote that resonates so much. Something Sean and I've talked about is in this known experience that we often reflect on, that for men, we only tend to get real or vulnerable often in moments of crisis. And you can't build a friendship in a moment of crisis. Like, you can be there for each other, but there's a practice you need to engage yourself in. So when that moment of crisis comes, you've built this foundation of depth. Um, we like to get pragmatic on here and offer people some ways to enter in more deeper into these ideas. What would you suggest as some steps in becoming more aware where your life is not integrated,
Mm-hmm.
or even
Yeah.
this idea of going slow that you talk about? If you touch on that
Mhm.
also.
Yeah. These are all such good questions, John. I don't think it's possible to think. I mean, I wouldn't argue anybody very far at all over a choice of words, but I have over time come to believe that the word integral is a better word than the word integrate. Integral assumes coherence. Integral assumes a seamlessness. Um, I'm not trying to put together two things that don't really belong to each other. My faith in my business, my faith in my politics, my faith in my sexuality, but I'm actually beginning to see into the very nature and character of the cosmos, to the way the world actually is, right? To see its integral character. That in fact it holds together in this way. To have eyes to see in the words of Jesus, to have ears to hear. What? Eyes to see, ears to hear what? Well, the way things really are made in God's world. Um, so it's not in a sense trying to say, well, how do I, integrate, my faith with my music, my art, with my political convictions, or it's a good work of the maturing of faith, of the sanctifying of faith over time, to be able to think more and more consistently, more and more coherently about these things. But I would say that that really is the task we have. Um, and I don't think it's possible to do that without having a theological imagination that's deep enough to begin to make sense of the complexity of the world. Um, I'm working on a book right now, and one of the chapters I draw upon, since you're in Dallas, you're not quite in Austin, but just go down the highway a little bit, that capital city that you have there. And one of the most interesting citizens of Austin is maybe one of the best filmmakers in the world these days, named Terrence Malick. And he's a remarkably gifted filmmaker. But in one of the chapters of the book, I've written especially about two films, The Tree of Life and The Hidden Life. And while we could talk for a long time about both of them, on the one hand, The Tree of Life is a story of the great, great, great story of all of reality. He never names the chapters, never says this is what it's about. If you're paying attention, if you have eyes to see, to use good language here, you think, sheesh, Terrence Malick, what are you doing here with this story? But it's a story of creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. The story of the way the world was supposed to be, the way the world is, the way the world could be, might be, should be, the way the world someday will be, actually. And that's the story he tells in The Tree of Life. It won the Cannes Gold Medal, the Gold Medal Prize, the year it came out 11 years ago now, the best film in the whole world that year. But this is the story of human life under the sun, of this story here, actually. If you want to understand your place in the story, you have to pay attention to the story that really is true about your life and mine. The Hidden Life is, of course, not the same story. It's a different film about an Austrian farmer in 1942 and 43 up in the most pristine, beautiful valley in the world, looks like at least, and it's innocent life, an earnest life, a hardworking life with a little farm and a wife and children. And the Nazis begin to slowly come into, to Europe and across Europe and finally into the mountains of Austria. Innocently, he says, yes, I will sign up for the National Guard because everyone in the village has to. All the men have to sign up. But then they say, well, now that you've signed up this way, Franz Jagenstarter, you have to Heil Hitler. He says, but I can't do that. Well, why can't you do that? Because I don't believe that. It doesn't matter what you believe, you just do it. They're just words to say. It doesn't matter what you believe, Franz, just say the words. So I can't say words I don't believe in. It's a tender, heart aching story, really. But clearly of, bringing into being with, full cinematic embodiment, Iris Murdoch's at crucial moments of choice. Most of the business of choosing is already over. So for the rest of the story, really, Franz lives into his decision to not have Hitler. I won't ruin the story for anybody here on the podcast, but clearly you see, of somebody who is willing to have his whole life play out with drama and tenderness and poignancy and, and the greatest terrors of the human heart. Because I believe this to be true about life in the world. And so, unless you have a theological imagination that can make sense of the beginning and the end of the story, like the Tree of Life does so beautifully, you can't really make sense of who you are in the story then either. So, John, I would say, where do we begin? Even though we could say a lot of things, I would say, make sure you get the story right. If you don't get the story right, you won't know where you came from, and you don't want to know where you're going. And therefore, you won't know, in fact, what to do with these days of your life.
Would you say getting the story right? I mean, because many of us grew up in a tradition or a family where we were told what the story is, and it had very clear bullet points. And this is exactly what you are to believe. I've found as in adulthood, and as I've allowed myself to be more curious and to listen to people outside of my tribe, that has changed quite a bit. So when you say theological, did you say create a creative theology? How did you say that?
I said theological imagination.
Imagination. Would you say that requires some curiosity that's willing to look outside of what you've always said to be?
Again, that's a pregnant question. And we could say, well, John, what do you mean by that? Let's go, let me poke back and ask you a few questions then too. I dropped out of university when I was a 20-year-old, spent 2 years away living this was in the counterculture days in American history, so a long ways from today. But I lived in communes for a couple of years, one in the Bay Area of California, one in Europe. And the one in Europe, after I hitchhiked across America and I did a lot of hitchhiking in those couple of years, actually. And I always took the hitchhiking rides to be a time to ask more questions. So, because there was a curiosity that I had about, so how do you make sense of the world? I'm trying to figure out how to make sense of the world for myself. How do you? What about this? I think about that. And, I spent all these hours in rides all across the country and in Europe, finally asked me, well, how do you make sense of things then? I ended up finally at a little place, a wonderful place that there was no internet, there were no brochures. It simply, the word on the street was, if you had an honest question, you could ask. You had an honest question, get an honest answer in this little community called La Brie. And so I ended up there finally, and I found it to be a place of intellectual hospitality, where people were taken seriously, but truth was taken seriously too. And for me, ever since then, I suppose, and all the years since then, I have tried to hold those together, that, a hospitality of mind and of heart, and have my own life, my own teaching, my own pedagogy, my own writing to be in some ways invitational. People who read me, and I don't read myself the same way, but people say, you ask a lot of questions in your writing, Steve. I say, I do? I say, well, maybe I do, but I'm not in some ways trying to play a game with anybody. I'm honestly interested in it too. And so for me, about 3 years ago, when the publisher of Francis Schaeffer's The God Who Was There decided to put out a 50th anniversary edition of his book, I got asked to write the foreword for it, which was kind of a surprise to me, because I was just not very long ago, a college dropout who found his way to La Brie too. But I did my best to, in some ways, tell something of the intellectual, moral, religious, spiritual, human, relational hospitality that most of all marked what La Brie was about, a place to come in with an honest question and get an honest answer. So I could say more about that, John, because you've asked a complex question, but I am a mere Christian in my deepest commitments about things. I'm not particularly interested in what the room off this hallway. I mean, I'm an Anglican by worship week by week, but I live most of my life quite consciously in that central hallway of C.S. Lewis's, the central hallway, that of mere Christianity. So I'm not particularly interested in the debates between the traditions, though I sometimes enter into the particular traditions and their questions. But I really live most of my life in that central hallway of the most important things.
So as you've grown in your professional life, by nature, right, when you are a professor and doctor and author and on board, you become the man that has the knowledge for others to find answers, right? Has this progression left you room to have those questions for yourself still, or has that the your role as guru, right, for others to find answers, has that somewhat not given room to those that hallway, right? Or do you find specific time and place for yourself to encourage that?
Again, I mean, we'd have to probably just sit face to face and talk, Don, for a while and say, well, tell me what about behind the question. What's in the question for you? I mean, I would say that, I mean, this is an image that I've been helpful to me in my life. None of us live all of life with our hands completely open about everything.
Right.
None of us live all of life with our hands completely closed about everything. We live in some ways, all of us, distinctively, uniquely, wonderfully differently, with some open palm, open hand, and then a closed hand, really. Some things are, in some ways, are not negotiable in that sense for all of us. And then some things we say, well, let's talk about that, okay? So for me, I think maybe maturity, maybe a growing maturity of mind and heart, is to realize with greater wisdom and insight, what are the things you're going to hold like this that you never would let go of? What are the things you're going to say? Well, okay, let's talk about this. We could talk about that, can't we? Of course we can. Now on this one too, I mean, depending on who you are and where you are, I mean, I know that at least on some level you read things I've written, but there's an epilogue, or I guess an epilogue to the Visions of Vocation book. I tell a story about a man on an airplane traveling across America and having hours of discussion with him about the deepest things of his life and of my life too. He was by creed, and proud to be an evolutionary determinist. That was how he described himself. Fancy pants lawyer in Washington, D.C., going off to Las Vegas for a weekend. And we talked about everything in those few hours together. I wrote in the epilogue, that when I asked him a particular question at a particular time after some hours of back and forth, and he gave a very surprisingly very candid answer to my question, I wrote that I didn't laugh at him, of course. I didn't smirk at him, because I knew he was just like me. I knew he had the same hopes I have, the same longings I have, the same desires I have, wanted the same things I want, really. Because why? Because he's a human being like I am. We're sons of Adam together, really. So born of the same hopes and fears that I have, actually. So I would say that my desire is, wherever I go, to treat people around me as people that I'm like them, with the same longings that I have, because longings are quite an important window into who we are as human beings. So after several hours of discussion, when he answered a hard question I'd asked him with a surprisingly candid answer, I thought, well, okay, I hear what you're saying. I'm not going to laugh at that, because I understand that, because that's just how I am, actually.
Steve, as I listen to you talk, this is not a loaded question. I know that sometimes we do that, but as I listen to you talk right now, and you talk about how you look at humanity as I am one with humanity. This man and I are probably more similar than we are different, which is very contrary to much of the conversation today. Well, that's very polarized and very us and them. Sean and I were talking about this just before the podcast. And I've just grown to have less and less tolerance for us and them conversations. But what I hear you saying is that this seamless life idea, maybe part of being that way yourself is seeing the world that way, like not just internally being seamless, but seeing my connection to the world as being more seamless, that it's not just us and them and categorize these people this way and this silo and that silo, and that maybe as I begin to be willing to see the world more seamless, that I myself will become that way. Is that, do you think that's accurate, or is that just?
No, it's a very good question, John. You guys are good people. So I told about my grandfather in part of a response to one of your earliest questions. I mentioned my father too in that, but I didn't say anything about him. But my father was a scientist, a plant pathologist for the University of California, which meant that he studied plants his whole life, and not just always picking them out of the ground and looking at the plant, but he saw through microscopes most of his life too. I think that my father gave me, if my grandfather gave me a certain set of gifts, a certain set of dispositions, my father did too in a different way. Because he would pray walking into the laboratory to have insight into the questions that were his that day. That he would have wisdom about what questions he was asking, what questions were not worth asking that day and this week and this year. But it wasn't only the laboratory and the greenhouses of his life, but we spent weeks of my boyhood years in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. And then, on to Colorado too, because I had been born there. Often in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado too. I remember walking, many times in the Rocky Mountains with my dad, and he had at one point in his academic studies memorized all the flowers of Colorado. So like we would be walking these high trails, and he would always know every flower really. And that just impressed me as a boy, and then a bigger boy and younger man thinking, Dad, I mean, like, this, don't you really? This is the known experience we're talking about today, of course, in the context of what you've named your podcast. But one of the deepest of all the questions of my life is, how do you hold what you know together with what you love? When you know, then you love. And if you don't love, then you don't really know. So in contrast, stark contrast to the contemporary language of, the world we all live in. Oh, yes, yes, yes. I know that, but, I mean, in the Hebrew world and worldview, actually, you're more tethered to a more intrinsic relationship between what you know and what you love. And if you're going to know, then you actually have to love. And if you don't know, if you don't love, then you don't know. So for me, I think my father mentored me. And not just that he academically had mastered, the flora of Colorado, but when we would walk the trails together, I always had a sense that he was really interested in, he had thought about, he cared about these flowers too. If you could see where I'm at right now in my study here in, Virginia, spring is coming to Virginia right now. We lived in this house for over 30 years. I have planted and replanted again and redug again and planted again. We have hundreds of daffodils that are popping up right now, all over our yard. Just hundreds and hundreds of them, front and back and on the sides. And the forsythia is out in its glory right now. I'm looking at that. I can see on the probably 20 dogwood trees that are in our yard. All different varieties. I can begin to see this week the little popping of the little buds that will become a flower, in a month or two, really. I have loved this. I love this. My wife would tell you, my children would tell you, my friends would say, Dad, Steve, Granddad, Grandpa, as I am to my grandkids, he loves his flowers, doesn't he? And I do, and I was never the person like my father who did a master's and a PhD in, botany and plant pathology. I didn't do that with my life. But in some ways, I came to think that it wasn't just that you would know about, but to really know, means that you had to love.
You may be familiar with this quote. We are called to see the world as it is in all its brokenness and pain and choose to still love it.
I've heard that before.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sure. I think what I've struggled with is love, right? So choose to still love it
Yeah.
is where there's an infinite spectrum of responses, right? What is love, right? In that respect, how do we love, as John said, in this world of when we're trying to live seamlessly, to understand it, we have to understand what love is, right? Or how we define it. How do you define loving the brokenness and pain?
Boy, oh boy. Yeah. Well, love can't be a cheap word.
Right.
No, it can't be a cheap word. It just cannot be a cheap word. Um, so when I've had discussions about this with people over the years in many different places, and sometimes there's a look of like, but what are you saying, Steve? I would say, well, let me ask you about you and your wife, you and your husband. Um, can your wife know you and still love you? Then all of a sudden it gets quite personal and like, oh, I see what you're saying. Because you mentioned to me Andrew Peterson's Weaklings group some years ago, John, in Nashville. If we actually know ourselves, we have some sense of our frailty. If we're honest about that at any level at all, actually, we know that we are frail people, we're weak people, we stumble along as people. And most poignantly and most terribly, maybe most wonderfully, that can be and should be and sometimes is most beautifully seen in a marriage, when actually you are known and loved at the very same time. So the great grief of this life is to be known and not be loved.
Mm.
Isn't it? I mean, that really is the greatest of the griefs of this life.
Yes.
I know who you are, and no, I don't think so. And I know too much. I know too much about who you are. I can't. I just won't. I cannot do that, actually. And so to say, what does it mean to love, Sean? I think, why I have argued in the Visions of Vocation book that, at the very heart of what vocation means in its deepest, truest sense, it is to know and to love the world at the same time. It's what God does, and we're called to be like God in the world. So, to that somehow by amazing grace, God knows me and still chooses to love me. That's it is amazing grace, actually, that I could be known by the God of heaven and earth and still be loved. That's quite surprising, actually. When my wife does that in her own earnest and hopeful and persistent ways, that's the greatest gift. People ask me often, like they must ask you too, how you doing, Steve? Without a blink, I almost always will say, my wife still loves me. But they know what a big deal that is, actually. It's a big deal, for my wife to know me and still love me. For me, to answer your question, I would say, well, what's it mean to love the world in its brokenness, its hurt, and its longings, and its complexity? Well, it is microscopically true in my relationship to my wife. Most personally, most tenderly, it is true there. But then, of course, if you begin to muse over that and to begin to think that through, you begin to realize that, it has to be true then of the wider world too. And it isn't just true of personal relationships, though it is manifest there, clearly. But it begins to be true of like a question like, well, can I love West Palm Beach, Florida? Now that I know it. Can I love Dallas, Texas? Now that I still know now that I begin to know Dallas, Texas. Can I love the Republic of Texas? Now that I begin to know the Republic of Texas. And is it possible to actually know the world, the political world, the economic sphere of life? Can begin to actually know the complexity and the range of this world and still care about it? Or will I choose? Again, one of the chapters in the Visions book, I'm sorry to be pedantic about it, but it is how I think about things. There's a chapter called The Great Temptations, and the great temptations I've written about them are Stoicism and cynicism. And what I've argued is they're two sides of the same coin, basically, even though they see themselves differently. But they both know, but say, I won't care.
Hmm.
Stoicism says, well, I used to be 20. I'm not 20 anymore. Come on.
Right,
You know,
right.
I've lived in the world for a while. I've done that. I've been here. I've seen this. No, I'm not going to be fooled again. You know, I'm not going to get hurt again. So I turn the barometer of my heart down. Why? Because I don't want to be hurt again. Why? Because if I know like that and take it in like that, I'll get hurt. I won't get hurt again. Thank you. Cynicism is not the same response, but it's also another way of repressing or suppressing, in the language of Romans chapter 1, what we know to be true. And cynicism says, well, you know, I've lived in Washington, D.C. for a few years now. And if I don't screw you, you're going to screw me. So I'll get mine done first. I'll stab you in the back first. Okay? Yeah. And we should remember, of course, that House of Cards was, first of all, a BBC production. You know, it wasn't Washington, D.C. And why is that? Because the screwing, the cynicism to get you first, it goes way, way back for us. And the cynics actually named themselves the cynics thousands of years before Jesus came into the world. It's a long, long temptation, really. You know, it goes way, way back in human history. Why? Because it's awfully hard, maybe the hardest thing in the whole world to really know and to still care.
Mm. I love that. That's yeah, that is John.
Yeah, as you were talking about that, and this is just personal processing and reflection, for whatever it's worth. But I was thinking about why, that's so true. We are sometimes we're afraid to be known because we don't think we'll be loved. We're afraid to know others deeper because we're afraid the more we know them, the less we'll love them. And I wonder if that is because we so often frame knowing by negatives. So we elevate the negatives or the differences or the things we disagree with, rather than looking for the good or looking for what we agree in or looking for the beauty. And I think we do that with others, and we probably do it with ourselves also. And so it causes us to, it's safer to maintain a distance or a surface level knowing, because we won't experience true love, but we also won't experience rejection. So we're just kind of in this middle ground on that. That's what I've been pondering.
There's really, just to play with you a little bit, John, there's a no man's land between those two that you just articulated, isn't there? Well, but I don't want to get too far in this business of knowing you or being known by you. Why? Because that would be something bad could happen, actually. I might know more about you than I want to know, or you might know about me than I want you to know. So I'm going to keep this a little bit, put some boundaries around this, because you see, if either side goes either this way or that way, that's not good for me, really. So I won't go there, thank you. It becomes a, quote, no man's land then.
So I'm always the pragmatic one. I always want to know, like, what can I do?
You said that twice now, John, on this podcast. You identified
What
yourself as pragmatic.
Yeah, I mean, I always want to know, what steps can I take? That's why, like, if I've gone to a therapist who just wants to let me talk the whole time, I'm always like, give me homework, tell me what to do. But I wanted to get your thought on one practice I think we both have in common, or we both enjoy. And a while back I was reading this book, Dear Teo by Irving Stone. And anybody that's not familiar with it, it's the compiled and edited letters from Vincent van Gogh to his brother Teo. And they are beautiful and heart-wrenching and heartbreaking. And it's reality. This is real, actual letters that he wrote back and forth with his brother. And something I was really struck by is he would take these walks often, like hours and hours. And something that a lot of us don't feel like we have the luxury of today, but he'd be out in the country for hours and hours, and all that he would glean from that time, he would share with his brother. As I've gotten older, I've come to value and appreciate those experiences so much more, whether it be taking a trip with Sean and going for a long hike, or just taking the time to take a walk. Do you feel like that's a practice that helps us regulate in all of this, as far as becoming more aware of our thoughts, or giving ourselves space to get even the power of boredom, bringing us to let some things come to the surface that that we don't think of when we're just distracted by going and going and going.
Mm-hmm. This isn't to be too self-reflective, John, but maybe 5 times, maybe 7 times, I've said to you in this last hour plus, we should take a walk together.
Yeah, you have.
Why should we take a walk? What do you think happens when we walk?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Unless you're just really obnoxious, John, I don't assume that you are, you're probably not going to be on your cell phone the whole time.
Mm.
You're probably going to put it in your pocket, at least, But most of the time, probably you're going to be paying attention to the conversation. You're on this conversation with somebody that you want to talk with. Uh, and because you have used the language, both of you, about slowing down, and I think in some ways we slow down with a walk like that too, don't we? We're not walking in a mall, or we're not walking to an appointment. We're not walking to get someplace, we're walking because we want to talk to each other. And so I think that the grace of that kind of a walk is, its purpose is to dig more deeply, to be more human together. We've not mentioned this person at all, and maybe I'll give you this as a last shot too, because you've asked questions about this. I just couldn't figure out how to say it to you right now, but this is the known experience, right? So if I was apprenticed by so-and-so and so-and-so when I went here and when I went there, and you can kind of maybe place me intellectually or theologically or philosophically, those were his teachers, weren't they? It might surprise you to know that one of my most chosen teachers was Simone Weil, the French philosopher, a woman in the first half of the 20th century. I've written about her quite a bit in different places, so I won't say much more here, but the last night of her life, she wrote in her journal words, and the very last words she wrote were these words: "The most important task of teaching is to teach what it means to know." If you were to walk across, Dallas, Texas, and all the schools of all different sizes and shapes, and, from the preschools to the kindergartens to the elementary to the private schools, the public schools, the universities, the colleges. I mean, thousands of people are, in those schools, and thousands of people are teaching in those schools. I wonder how close anyone would get to Simone Weil's argument. The most important task of teaching is to teach what it means to know.
I think we got to end right there.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's it.
I think that's, I think we will leave people with much to consider if we do that.
Yeah.
Steve, before we go, would you just tell us about your new book that you're working on, and how we might enjoy it soon?
That would be the great hope, to enjoy it sooner than later. Sure. I'll give you the 3-minute version of it or so, okay? Maybe. But 10 years ago or so, I was asked by a magazine in Toronto, Canada, if I would write they said, "You've been watching Washington politics for a long time." They didn't say you've been watching Washington girls for a long time, interestingly, because I had moved beyond that 17-year-old question to a life in the political world of Washington for most of my life. Been watching Washington politics. Is there a vocation in the political world, was the question, which I'd given years to thinking about, actually. And it was a good question to be asked. And I wrote an essay after a summer's thinking about it. I called "Making Peace with Proximate Justice." And what I argued was, if you're going to actually come here to this city of great glories and shames and stay here for a while, knowing the city, still choosing to care about the city, but hard thing to do, actually, you'd have to be willing to make peace with proximate justice, by which I meant some justice, not everything. Healthcare, education reform, U.S.-Israel relations, whatever it's going to be, really. But you'd have to be willing to work hard for something that was honest and right and true, because you're never going to get everything. So would you be willing to make peace with proximate justice, with something that's right to be done? I've been thinking about that ever since then. And probably 3 or 4 years ago, I was in my last year at Regent College and been asked by a group of wonderful people in Central Europe to come speak to them 30 years after the Velvet Revolution, which is what Havel and his colleagues had brought into being in the then called Czechoslovakia. And they said, 30 years later, Stephen, would you come talk to us about what the challenge of vocation for the common good is 30 years after the Velvet Revolution? We'd hoped that all good things would happen when communism was no longer dominant. Well, 30 years later, it hasn't. these are still the problems we have, really. So I spent several days, with them, laboring in the love of my heart, trying to think with them about what the recovery of vocation would mean to them 30 years later. How would you still work at things that were important, even if all that you hoped would happen has not happened? I came back when I was deciding to leave Canada, come back to the States. I thought, if I can find a way to write a book about the proximate, I want to. So I spent the last 2 years pretty steadily working away at this book. I'm about done, I think, with it. And, it essentially is about, that maybe it's asking a question, because a lot of my writing has been born of questions, really. Would you be willing to work at something that mattered, even if you didn't get everything that you wanted? Everything maybe that God wanted, everything that the world needed. Would it still be worth working for it? Would you be willing to make peace with proximate justice in the public square? Would you be willing to have a marriage, just to kind of be very tender and personal with all of us here for a moment, that had some honest happiness to it, some true happiness in it? Even if everything that you imagined and thought and read about, and saw in the movies wasn't your experience, but you had actually a touchable, true, honest happiness. Would that be worth it? Or will you require of this everything in the now but not yet of history? We don't have access to everything anytime. So it's really a book about how do you keep your heart alive when everything you think ought to be is not? And can you live a life trying to work out, approximate happiness in marriage, approximate justice in the public square, and on and on and on and on. So
that sounds like a prophetic book for our time.
Yeah.
Where people are all or nothing, this and that, in or out,
Yeah.
us and them. I look forward to hearing that.
Yeah.
Me too. Yeah.
Well, sir, we really appreciate getting to know you a little bit more, and that was my hope, right? Your work is your work, but who is Steve is very important to me. That is my work with coffee, right? So that others can be, so I can learn their story 5 minutes at a time. So giving us your time, we deeply value that, and we look forward to next time.
It's good to be with you guys, because I would say that's really true, John and Sean. You ask very, very good questions.
Well, thank you, and we will take you up on taking a walk, hopefully sooner rather than later. So,
okay.
For everybody that's listening, we're going to come back to you in about 15 seconds with after the interview. Thank you, Steve, so much for being with us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Me too. Thank you, guys. Yeah.
Welcome back for after the interview. We've just been talking to Stephen Garber, who's somebody that I was introduced to through an organization called Art House, to his writings. Sean, how did you meet Steve?
Through my good friend Alan McDonald in DC.
Yeah.
So he's
right.
Yeah.
Stephen is a legend. I encourage you to go out, check out his writings. I mean, the quote of his that really piqued my curiosity was, he says that culture is upstream from politics, that all politics are a result or reaction to culture. We won't dive into that here, but that's a fascinating idea. I would say, first of all, wow, talking to this guy feels like talking to Yoda a little bit. Would you agree with that?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. There was no straight to the point answer. You could tell he was a professor, right? A professor that wanted to spur thought, which I loved, those types of professors that made you think, but he wanted to paint a picture, and then you had to find the answer in that picture.
Yes. I would say he is a classic philosopher, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm looking for three easy steps to live a more seamless life. and he's gonna tell me a story about something. And
I think you asked something like that twice, and I was like, John, you should probably stop.
and he kind of, the second time, he kind of laughed. Oh, you've mentioned that you're a pragmatist twice.
Yeah, he
Good
did.
for you.
Uh,
So, yeah, I mean, I mean, not to overdo it, but I kind of feel like it was kind of like what Jesus was like, right? People, like, I forget the numbers, but something like he was asked like hundreds of questions. He responded to those questions with a couple hundred other questions, and he actually answered the question like less than 10 times
right.
in all the gospels. So, um, I guess that's a good category to be in if that's how you're communicating with people.
Yeah, well, but he has been working with the Mars Corporation, which, if you don't know what Mars owns, they own everything in the
Mm-hmm.
sweet sector, right? And he's been working with them for about 10 years as a consultant to do major cultural changes in the company. But that struck me as somewhat hilarious, just in the way that he works, right? Because you would think a corporation like that, they want 3 steps to X,
Yes.
Y, and Z, right? But he's not that type of guy. So, he told me in a private interview that he met with, CEO. It's not like he's meeting levels down. He's meeting with the top. So those meetings are fascinating to me, right? And what corporations like Mars see in him and really want to implement, right? And I asked him that over the phone, and I'm not sure what he said, but I didn't take many notes because I was constantly thinking about, okay, what is his answer? Yeah, I don't know. He is, his essays are phenomenal though. If you don't want to read books, he writes essays quite a bit on social media, and he's a really skilled writer, right?
I think one thing I really took away from it, when he was asked, um, when did you start thinking about this seamless life idea?
Yeah.
He told a story, shockingly, about his grandfather, and that he saw his grandfather live out a seamless life. So not only did he know it was possible, to him it was normal.
Yeah.
And it reminded me, you and I have both been reading Bono's autobiography, and or memoir, whichever you call it. But he
Yeah.
talks about how he grew up in a home that was a paradox.
Yeah.
Mom was Protestant, his dad was Catholic. His dad was Catholic, blue collar, but loved opera. And then his mom died when he was young, like 12 or 14, and his whole life he was in this community of men, and but this memory of his mom informing it. And so he said, of course our music was a paradox because my whole life was a paradox growing up.
Mm.
So it just made me think about how much our childhood informs our view of the world and how we approach the world and what we think of as possible in the world.
It has a huge impact. My grandfather was, I mean, those are some of the best memories for me growing up. I think the sad part was, and he painted a beautiful picture, and maybe there was nothing that tainted that image as he grew into a man, right? So we have heroes when we're young, and they do inform us. Um, but then as you grow and you dig a little deeper, you see, oh, he was a man too, and these were the issues he carried, right? And things I don't want to carry. Or, this was his relationship with my dad, and now I see it for what it is. Um, and that's that's the difficult part, right? Is I tended to blow up the idols of my youth rather than kind of count them as a foundation, for me becoming who I am. I don't know if that makes sense. It's more of a something else I have to reconcile. It's because that image of a hero wasn't actual for me. It was what a 7-year-old saw, but it's not what a 40-year-old man sees.
Yeah, I mean, we can go real deep here, but it's, I think, as the elder in our friendship, I got about 10 years on you. My experience has been that there becomes this season of life where you become very aware of your parents' flaws,
Mm.
and you become very aware of their humanness, and it's easy to focus on those things, and to be resentful for them. These flaws of yours created these flaws or these problems in me,
Right.
and now I'm mad about it. And then you move on. I feel like past that, hopefully there comes a reconciliation of that they were human just like I am, and they are human, and those flaws, while they're real, they don't define them fully.
Right.
And you can move back into a place, I guess, of acceptance. Maybe it's the whole grief cycle, you know,
Right.
of
Right.
anger and bartering and all of that, bargaining and acceptance. And I hope that, yeah, we can move to a place, and I think most of us do move to a place of acceptance. And depending, I mean, there's things that a lot of people have been through that are horrible, that have no redeeming value to whatsoever. And that's another situation.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's part of life, is working
Yeah.
through that with your heroes of your childhood.
Yeah. What I had hoped to ask Stephen, and we just didn't get to it, was, you know, the seamless life uh, kind of works uh, when life works, right? So, I had mentioned, we are our choices, but as we know, life is difficult for some people from day one and continues, right? So living a seamless life is not the same for all of us. I think there's a lot of us that would say, I need to completely cut myself away from everything that I was and the family I come from, and starting from that spot, it's so difficult. I have great empathy for people that come from an abusive house. They're poor. Um, they have no emotional bandwidth or physical access to anything that creates the hope for a seamless life, right? A good, seamless, holistic, healthy life. They're just really trying to survive. Um, and those are the people that really need just intensive mentors like a Stephen to rebuild a whole life into something that's worthy of being seamless. I don't know if that makes sense. And just kind of what he's done, with work in that space, right? There's his list of accomplishments is deep and wide, but as you gain in accomplishments, you almost move further away from the people that need it most. I don't know if that makes sense. Then you start getting hired for conferences, you're speaking to leaders, you're trying to make their life better, and then all the people, the everyday Joe, don't really have access to you anymore, or they can read your book, but they still don't know how to create this seamless life because things have been so hard. And so I would have loved to kind of explore that more, right? Like, what does he say to those people?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, to that like point of growing in influence, and I mean, you see it, I mean, with so many people. But I think it's opportunity cost to everything,
Right.
right? If you stay smaller and stay more in touch with individuals, you're missing the opportunity to help thousands and thousands of people. And when you operate up here, you're missing the opportunity to connect more with individuals. You just don't have, we're finite beings. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know that one is better or worse than the other.
Right.
It's just the price that you pay for the choices that you make. So
Yeah.
um all that's to say, I am incredibly grateful for Mr. Garber. I hope that we can have him on again sometime.
I would love if we can pull it off, if we're ever in DC, to actually record a podcast while we're taking a walk with him.
Oh, I like it. I'll fly to
That would
DC for
be
that.
that would be amazing, right? The audio might be noisy, but I think it'd be well worth it if we could ever
Dude,
do that.
let's do it. You set it up. I'll fly to DC. We'll take a walk. I'd like to take a walk around the city, and I think he has so much to say about the history of that place and culture. And you figure out the technology end of it, and I'll do it.
Yeah. That'd be
Awesome.
neat.
Well, thank you once again for hanging around for after the interview and listening to our own musings and thoughts and ramblings about our guests. Like you, we're listening to these things for the first time whenever we're doing the interview, and we're not nearly as educated or informed as our guests are. We have lots of questions. We don't get them all. A lot of times I'll go back and listen to these and think, oh, I wish I would have asked this question or that question. And that's kind of the things we talk about here and after the interview. But thank you again. Hope that you will follow our podcast. We have some great guests coming very soon. We hope that you will continue to live in and experience the power of being known.